And thank you very much, and thank you all for your warm welcome. Good morning, bonjour tout le monde. Je suis heureux d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui sur le territoire de traité 7. Et je vous suis très reconnaissant pour votre service et pour votre professionnalisme dont vous faites preuve tous les jours en tant qu'agent correctionnel. The federal correctional system is essential to the safety and security of Canadian communities and our society as a whole, and I welcome this opportunity to meet with correctional officers at the invitation of your union representatives, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. The success of the system is due in large part to the skill and dedication of the correctional officers who work in institutions all across the country. You do your jobs, for the most part, behind institutional walls, and that is largely out of sight, and for most Canadians, out of mind. But the work you do, the challenges you face, and the contributions you make cannot be allowed to go unacknowledged and without thanks. One of the first trips that I made as Public Safety Minister was to Kingston, where I visited Collins Bay. I saw firsthand that correctional officers are skilled and committed individuals who operate in a uniquely difficult and often dangerous environment. You manage a vast array of challenging people. Some of them pose serious risks, many of whom have histories of mental health problems, addictions, poverty, racism, historical trauma, and physical and sexual abuse. Preparing them to return to their communities as productive, law-abiding citizens is an immensely challenging task. And it's critically important because the vast majority of them do return to their communities at some point. It can't happen successfully and safely unless correctional institutions are safe and effective places to live and to work. In theory, your job is to maintain security so that all of the parole and program officers and medical professionals and others can do their work. And if that were all that you did, well, yours would be a fairly straightforward, honorable, and essential vocation. But you know better than anyone that the division of responsibilities is nowhere near that clear-cut. At any given moment, you might also be acting as a social worker or a paramedic or a therapist, just to give a few examples. And that's on top of your basic responsibility of protecting the safety of employees, inmates, volunteers, contractors, visitors, and ultimately, ordinary people in communities across Canada. In other words, the very first thing I want to say to all of you is thank you. Merci, thank you for your service. Our criminal justice system could not function without you. And ensuring that you have a safe, supportive work environment is a prerequisite for all of the things that our correctional system does. And that has been the focus of each of my meetings with UCO representatives over the last few years. By the way, correctional officers have been very ably represented at those meetings. They haven't been easy, Jason, because you and your colleagues never let the minister get too comfortable, and that's good. But I have appreciated your candor, your direct and constructive approach, and the obvious commitment that this union has to the women and men who do your job. You've raised some issues in those meetings that our government has been able to address, like changing the law to allow the use of body scanners in federal prisons. That is in Bill C-83, which is getting closer to final passage. And you've brought up other things that we're still working very hard to achieve, like, for example, including the families of correctional officers under the Memorial Grant Program. I share your desire to see correctional officers covered by that program. And my objective is to work with you to achieve that extension. I want very much to see it done. Jason, as your tenure as president of this union comes to a conclusion, I want to wish you the best. Thank you for all of the work that you have done over the last 3 years. And I certainly look forward to having a strong working relationship with the successor that all of you will elect later this week. One of the issues that I'm sure will remain a point of emphasis is post-traumatic stress. On day one in my job as minister, the Prime Minister gave me a mandate to work with the Minister of Health to develop a national action plan on post-traumatic stress injuries, PTSI, for all public safety personnel. Correctional officers have been included in that process every step of the way, from the beginning of the consultations 3 years ago to the launch of the action plan last month. The action plan will support the treatment of public safety officers, as well as prevention, early intervention, and reduction of stigma that is all too often associated with PTSI. It will fund cutting-edge research. It will facilitate the sharing of best practices, and it will lay the foundation for treatment that is relevant, effective, and more accessible. One of the big challenges in this area is that there's a serious lack of solid information and data about how PTSI impacts the public safety professions and what interventions are going to be the most useful to deal with it. To deal with that, we're putting $20 million toward a new national research consortium involving the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment. This investment will fund work that is specifically focused on PTSI among public safety personnel, to find better ways of preventing post-traumatic stress injuries and to ensure that you and your colleagues have access to treatment that works when and where you need it. Another challenge is the fact that Canada is such a big country, with lots of public safety officers in rural and remote locations. If you work, for instance, in Port Cartier, Quebec, or Grande Cache, Alberta, you don't have a big urban center nearby with a major research hospital or treatment facility. So we're investing $10 million in a pilot project providing cognitive behavioral therapy for PTSI to be available to public safety officers over the internet. And that way, rather than making you travel to get treatment, we can bring the treatment to you. Et nous allons continuer de travailler avec les employés correctionnels et les autres agents responsables de la sécurité publique à travers le Canada, afin de répondre à vos besoins en matière de santé mentale. Votre bien-être est fondamental au succès de notre système correctionnel. PTSI can never be accepted as just a normal part of the job. And your mental wellness is not a peripheral concern. Rather, it is absolutely essential to achieving the mission of our corrections system and to keeping the public safe. Your mental well-being and your well-being in general must always be a top priority. And that's especially true when legislative or policy changes related to federal corrections are being considered. The most significant of those major changes right now is Bill C-83, legislation that will provide a new way of dealing with inmates who need to be separated from the general population for safety reasons. As I'm sure you know, there has been a series of court decisions striking down the current system of administrative segregation as unconstitutional. The effect of those rulings has been temporarily suspended and appeals are underway. But as things stand at the moment, segregation will become unconstitutional in Ontario and British Columbia by the middle of June. And the legal challenges facing segregation certainly don't end there. Other cases are also underway. What concerns me is the possibility that admin-seg will become illegal potentially as soon as this summer, with no realistic alternative for you to use when you need to manage a dangerous inmate. And that's why we are proposing the Structured Intervention Units, or SIUs, in Bill C-83. In SIUs, inmates who pose a safety risk can and will be separated from the general population of an institution, and that can happen on an urgent basis if that is necessary. The main difference compared to segregation is that inmates in SIUs will get more programs, interventions, and access to mental health care. Meaningful human contact will not be cut off. They will be offered 4 hours daily out of their cells instead of only 2, and at least 2 hours of meaningful interaction with other people, including staff, service providers, volunteers, visitors, and other compatible inmates. I'm sure that no one is opposed to the idea of providing interventions and programming and treatment if we can address the underlying reasons that someone had to be separated in the first place and then return them more safely to the general population. That result is better for everyone. But there is also no doubt that the more interventions and time out of a cell an inmate gets, the greater are the demands that are placed on correctional officers. So shortly after Bill C-83 was introduced last fall, UCO issued a press release that said this, and I quote, "In order to implement the bill in its entirety, significant resources must be provided by the government." End of quote. And I completely agree. And a few weeks after that press release, the Finance Minister announced major new investments, specifically for this purpose. $300 million over the next 6 years will be used to hire the new staff needed to implement the SIUs safely and effectively. That includes many new correctional officers, as well as program officers, parole officers, behavioral counselors, Indigenous liaison officers, and others. And another $150 million over 6 years will bring in many new mental health professionals to work in the SIUs and throughout federal corrections. And that is in addition to another $80 million for mental health in corrections in our previous 2 federal budgets. CSC will finally have enough mental health staff to conduct a diagnosis at intake for every new inmate and provide treatment early before a minor issue becomes a crisis. There will also be more mental health staff at RTCs to provide inmates the treatment they need and to let correctional officers be correctional officers. You are highly trained professionals, but you're not psychiatrists, and you shouldn't have to be. The bottom line with C-83 is that it will give you a safe alternative to segregation. It will provide inmates with better interventions and treatment, and you will have the resources to implement it safely and successfully. And I hope that you'll be able to help work with the Senate in the weeks ahead to get this accomplished. And one last point about this. It is true that there can sometimes be a gap between a government's good intentions and the reality of what happens on the ground. To make sure that doesn't happen with C-83, we'll be appointing an advisory panel to monitor the implementation of the new SIU system, to make sure it gets done right. Sound cool? Awesome. Is the whole thing down? There we go. We're back. Thank you. Just finish that sentence. The purpose of the advisory committee is to monitor the implementation of the SIUs and to make sure they get done right, that they are accomplishing the purpose for which they are intended. And, significantly, that the money gets invested on time to ensure that you and others in the system can do your job. The panel will include people with a variety of relevant experience and expertise and a variety of different perspectives. I hope to be able to announce the names in the next few weeks, including some of the names that were specifically recommended by UCO. I can confirm that the panel will include former correctional officers to ensure that your operational realities are a constant consideration as C-83 moves forward. And if adjustments need to be made along the way based on the advisory panel's recommendations, then those adjustments will be made. And speaking of being open to feedback and willing to make changes, let me just mention needle exchanges. In the fall, 3 of your representatives, Messrs. Goodale, Eno, and Bloomfield, came to see me in Ottawa. And what they said was that correctional officers are not opposed to harm reduction. And of course, we all want to see fewer overdoses, less transmissions of AIDS and hepatitis C and other infectious diseases. But could CSC try a different model? Instead of providing safe injection kits, what about having a safe injection site, also known as an overdose prevention site run by healthcare? They were having conversations with CSC management about that, and I said I would talk to the Commissioner and we'd see what we could do. Well, there were several good discussions that took place after that, and I thank the Commissioner and her team, and Jason, thank you and your team for the constructive engagement on this issue. Earlier this year, CSC applied to Health Canada for a class exemption from the Controlled Drug and Substances Act. In other words, they sought the approval needed to run overdose prevention sites within federal institutions. And I'm pleased to tell you that just a couple of days ago, Health Canada granted that exemption. And that means the plan to use the overdose prevention site model at Drumheller will go ahead. And the progress over the last few months that we've seen on this particular issue, I think can also be a model for how government and CSC leadership and CSC employees can work together to advance other common objectives. Mr. President, the last topic that I want to raise with you this morning is actually the very first one that I discussed with Commissioner Kelly when she began last year in her new role. And I'm talking about the issue of harassment. If you don't have a safe and healthy place to work, free from harassment or bullying or discrimination, then our correctional system simply cannot function properly. I'm encouraged by some recent positive steps, including the confidential tip line and email account that were created for Edmonton Institution, now being expanded to other regions. New training focused on creating respectful workplaces and reducing workplace violence. The new policy that action plans are created following all harassment complaints. The ongoing development of a new workplace mental health and well-being strategy for federal corrections. The outreach being done by CSC leadership to other departments and agencies to learn from their experiences. And the publication of CSC's first annual report on workplace climate and employee well-being. Parliament has also adopted Bill C-65, amending the Canada Labour Code to better protect all federal employees in every workplace from harassment and sexual violence. And I know that some of the things that I've just listed, like publishing reports and developing strategies, can sound a little hollow to a correctional officer grappling every day with a coworker or a supervisor who's making her fear going to work. But what the reports and the strategies acknowledge is that there is a problem, and acknowledging the problem is the first step towards solving it. So I'm hopeful and determined that CSC will continue making progress toward the goal of providing a safe and healthy workplace for everyone who works in federal corrections. Nothing less will do, and that is now required by the law. Mesdames et messieurs, vous avez l'un des emplois les plus durs qui soient. Mais votre profession est également noble et gratifiante. J'espère que lorsque vous faites face aux nombreux défis qui font partie de la vie d'un agent correctionnel, vous arrivez à garder cela en tête. People enter your custody at a very low point in their lives. They have done destructive, sometimes despicable things. They have hurt people. They've broken their contract with the rest of society. And you are called upon to deal with it. A small number of them are just irredeemably dangerous. But most are capable of turning their lives around if they get the structure, the treatment, the support, the accountability, the framework, and the humanity that they need. Every time someone leaves a correctional institution and doesn't come back, every time someone leaves an institution and goes on to live a law-abiding, productive life, that is your legacy. And it's an extraordinary contribution to Canadian society as a whole, of which you have every right to be enormously proud. You have my gratitude and my deepest respect. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.